Good morning, everyone. And today we're going to talk about cowardice. So last week we talked about freedom, and one of the things that we talked about with freedom is the idea that it requires you to discomfort yourself. Right? So one of the quotes, that the shorter version of the quote from last time was, "A man who has nothing which he is willing to fight for, nothing which he cares more about than he does about his personal safety, is a miserable creature who has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself." That was John Stuart Mill. And so in there it talks specifically about personal safety, right? If nothing is more important than your own personal safety, then you are afraid of endangering your personal safety for anything of greater value, or what some might consider greater value. And so some of the definitions of coward and cowardice that I found, I thought were really interesting in examining this idea a little bit further. So a coward, by one definition, is a person who lacks the courage to do or endure dangerous or unpleasant things. There are a couple words in there that I think are important. One is endure. So it doesn't mean to put yourself at risk. It means to endure something that is either dangerous or unpleasant. I like that idea of unpleasant because we've talked about before, comfort precludes growth. If we're comfortable, we're generally not growing, we're generally not learning. And so if you're afraid to endure discomfort, it makes you a coward, but not in the traditional sense of lacking the bravery to charge into battle or to put yourself at personal physical risk, but just that you're afraid to discomfort yourself. So other definitions of cowardice are the lack of courage or firmness of purpose, fear that prevents an individual from taking a risk, and a lack of courage to face danger, difficulty, opposition, pain, etc. So one of my favorite ideas when it relates to cowardice, bravery, and recklessness is Aristotle and his idea of virtues, which were balances between extremes. Right? So on one side you would have cowardice, which is basically being overwhelmed by fear, and on the other side you'd have recklessness, which is the idea that you would charge into any challenge without thinking, right? And then the virtue, right, the middle is bravery. And so I think this is important when we talk about freedom that we've talked about from last week, but then also when we just talk about being a good human and the consequences of cowardice for humanity. I think it's important to hold these ideas in mind, and then what we'll do is we'll go through kind of different levels of cowardice and how it affects us. So at the personal level, the way that I've seen this, or I've experienced this most often, is that we don't tell someone something because it's uncomfortable, right? We don't tell a friend that the problem they're having might be their fault, right? When they ask, does this make me look good? And we say yes, right? There's a little bits of discomfort there. And most of us may consider that to be, it's a white lie. It's not going to harm anything. It's not a big deal. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that we fear that uncomfortable relationship, right? We fear that uncomfortable discourse. We might fear upsetting people. We might fear failure of that relationship. But the consequence of that then is that we are not conditioned to be discomforted, right? Those are all learning opportunities both for you and that other person, where there may be some nugget of truth or some nugget of information that they would get out of that you can't provide them because you're afraid to do so. Now again, the virtue, Aristotle's virtue is about the moderation between those two things. So do we go around being overly truthful? I don't know. I don't know exactly what that looks like in your daily life, and I think that's a question that we all have to answer. But it's something I think that we have to consider, that we have this fear. And I would say particularly in our society, we have this fear of confrontation, except for on Facebook, right? We're not afraid of confrontation on Facebook. You're right, it's not really confrontation, but... So telling our friends or family in particular is something difficult. So family is one of those things where you've got those built-in power structures. You've interfaced with them in a certain way over time. And so to have difficult conversations with them brings a whole bunch of baggage with it. I know my mom and I have had conversations as I've gotten older about how we grew up and how I grew up. And there was definitely a hesitance at first because I think she was afraid of what I might say about how we grew up, and there were definitely challenges that we faced together. In the end, I told her that the challenges that I faced, while unpleasant, also made me who I was today, or who I am today. And so I think there's a lot of goodness to be gained from having those difficult conversations. And one of those things, as you do it, you gain practice. You become better at them. And you realize that the discomfort you face while still there is not nearly as uncomfortable as you might think. And ultimately, at the personal level, we fail to make things better for the ones we love due to our fear of discomfort. So I think that's where we are with personal cowardice. Now, there are the traditional examples of failing to rush into a dangerous situation, whether it's to save someone or into battle or whatever that happens to be. But those are very rare circumstances, and we can come up, I think, with good reasons why people may not rush in. A lot of it has to do with evolutionary biology, in that we generally tend to stay away from things that are threatening to us. And yet we see throughout history people will rush in for family members, for members of their tribe, because there is that evolutionary sense of collective support that we have that's innate within us. But in a given circumstance, it's hard to judge with hindsight what someone should or should not have done. So I actually think those less threatening circumstances are more important, because those are the ones that affect us every day, and yet we still fail to show the bravery and counter our cowardice. From the community perspective, a lot of it is just failure to care for others. Because a lot of what I see, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else, is that it's easier for us to not have to show understanding to those who have less. It's easier to walk past the homeless person. It's easier to know that someone doesn't have enough money or enough food. Because if we have to care about that one, then we have to care about all of them. And I think for many of us, it would break our hearts, in a sense. It would bring upon us great discomfort to realize that as another human, I am responsible for the rest of the community, right? I am my brother's keeper. And that's a hard burden to bear when we see so much suffering. Now, does that mean we have to give away all of our stuff? No, because particularly I don't think that would work, right? And then we're in the same circumstance and we're not helping anyone. But the fact that we accept the responsibility for that is a big burden. And then what we choose to do with that, of course, is most important, but that's a decision for each of us individually. And the other thing is not speaking out for the repressed voice. It's not that other people don't have voices. Everyone always has a voice. We talked about that last week with freedom. There's always a choice, even if that choice is death, in terms of speaking out or acting out on behalf of your interests. But for those with privilege, and for those with more of a voice, or whose voice is more easily heard, I think we also have that responsibility to speak out. And when we don't, we show that cowardice, that fear of discomfort, that we don't want to face the same oppression or the same ostracism that these repressed groups do. So I think that's important, particularly in the practice of this church, of the Humanist Church, to go out and stand with groups that are repressed. So to go out to the LGBT events and to stand with them, to do nothing more than to be with them there and say, I am your ally, I think is a very important thing. And then in the sense of community cowardice, you go back to the example of Germany pre-World War II and the poem of First They Came for These People. And I said nothing because I was not one of these people. And then, of course, the poem ends with, and then they came for me, and no one was left to speak for me. And that's the consequence of community cowardice, is that over time, communities will decay because we fail to stick up for them. And it's not just the communities that are, the parts of the community that are poor, or the parts of the community that aren't fed, or the parts of the community that are different, whether from race or orientation. What ends up happening is that the community as a whole will decay, generally through instability. As communities are allowed to decay, crime increases, values go down for properties, right? There are systemic consequences to ignoring those groups, but it requires that initial step of being discomforted and speaking out for them. And what about at the national level? What does cowardice look like at the national level? To me, this is a lack of leadership. Personally, I think Congress in particular has demonstrated a cowardice to take the mantle of leadership. Because to take the mantle of leadership might mean that you failed to win your next race, that you have to take positions that are better for the country as a whole at the expense of your particular demographic or your particular area. And to me, that's the failure to do a difficult thing, and therefore is a form of cowardice. Another thing that we do, I think, at the national level is we support a system that mines value from people. It treats people simply as a resource without then providing for them, right? If we're trading value and then we're feeding back into the system that supports people, well, then that's good. That's exchange of value, right? Because ideally, the whole point of producing value in the first place is to raise human progress, right? Or provide for more, right? Abundance, a world of plenty, right? To provide the conditions for my family to survive, and then my community to survive, and then my country and the rest of humanity and the planet to survive. That ideally should be what we're after. And that's whether you're using the more laissez-faire system of capitalism or a less laissez-faire system or more managed system of something trending more towards socialism. The goals of those systems are to provide for humanity. They're just different mechanisms to do that. So when we support a system that explicitly mines value from people and extracts value in a one-way proposition, which is generally upward towards people that already have a lot of value, that's not a good idea. And that's not a popular position. And I'm not going to prescribe policy on how we would correct that. But to not speak out against a system that does that is another form of cowardice. And to say that, well, things are this way because it's the best system, which I think is a bunch of crap, honestly. No system is the best system. Systems are designed to maximize certain kinds of value. And if our system is maximizing value in a way that's not conducive toward human progress, then we need to speak out against that. And what about at the human level? All of humanity. What does cowardice look like? As the collective, which is nothing more than all of our individual cowardice. The first thing I think that we are afraid of is being willing to envision a path and a future that's better. We focus a lot on today. We focus a lot on now, how things are broken now, how specific little pieces of today could be fixed to be optimized for whatever group we're a part of. But I think we stop and ask ourselves, what would a better future even look like? And what would it take to get there? What would the hard work be? And in doing so, we fail to provide for humanity's future. If we can't sit down and say, I can envision a better future, not a utopia, not a magical future where everything's perfect, but just to envision something better, and then say, I think we could get here. And it will take a lot of work, and we'll have to figure it out and advocate for that. If we fail to do that, then we're going to be stuck with what we have. And if we fail to be able to change our system, eventually it will fail. Any system or any organism in nature that fails to evolve will eventually die. And if we have those powers that are entrenched in the system, keeping it as it is, because it benefits them for now, eventually that system will fall apart. And it's due to nothing more than our lack, or due to nothing more than our unwillingness to be discomforted, our cowardice in that way. So I had a conversation with a friend of mine this week. And it really clarified for me what this looks like. And I don't mean to say that everyone else is a coward and because I am a human, and so I have the same struggle every day. That I see things I know are wrong, and I don't speak out against them because it's not expedient, or it wouldn't be the right time to do it, or it might be uncomfortable. And so I'm not calling my friend a coward any more than I call myself a coward. But we had this conversation, and in his mind, we just have to wait for our system as it is to burn, and then we rebuild it. That is a way, right? Nature does that. It'll burn down a forest, and it'll regrow. But what if we could, and being somewhat of an optimist, I think we can, build a system that's better, that can continue to adapt? And I'm not just talking about the US system or any system in particular, but just a human system. How do we build a human society that can continue to adapt well enough to not need to burn to the ground? Because I think that wastes a lot of human potential. There's a lot of suffering that goes into that isn't useful, that maybe doesn't get us the progress that we need. Some suffering does, if you go back to our talk about comfort and growth. But I think we can. I think we can build a system where we can provide for people that can be agile enough to change itself, to survive. We haven't gotten there yet. We've had many systems throughout the course of human history, and except for the ones that currently exist today, they've all failed in one way or another due to circumstances or timing or demographics or whatever it happens to be. But I don't think that means we should just quit. Well, all systems fail, therefore. Well, you're right, all systems have failed up to this point. But have we learned nothing in the course of human history? Are we the same as we've always been? I would argue no. And so we have to have the courage, we have to work against our cowardice to say, I think we can make something better. I can envision a better future. And so that conversation really helped, again, to clarify that idea that some people feel that, well, there's nothing I can do, it's going to burn down anyway, so why try? I think we have to speak out against that fundamental idea. I think we can do things. I think we can speak out. I think we can hold our elected officials accountable. I think we can have the conversations that get people to think about the responsibility they have as a voting citizen. I think we can do all of those things. Because ultimately, if we don't, humanity suffers. So I think if I were going to argue for any ethical obligation that we have as humans, it's to work for a system that provides for humanity, for our future, for us to thrive and survive. So freedom requires us to speak out. We have to do that by countering our cowardice. And that comes by practicing being comfortable with discomfort. So as you go forward in the next week, think about those things. How will you become comfortable with discomfort? How will you speak out? How will you take action to bring about a better future for humanity? So I'll leave you this week with a quote from Confucius. To see the right and not do it is cowardice. Thank you.